Hello and welcome back to this video. And today is going to be one of these special videos. Yes, I'm going to deal with social media, and today is going to be Twitter. And remember that I'm going to do this mini series within the series in which I'm going to focus on social media. And today is going to be again Twitter, what Twitter might do to your brain. Not necessarily thinking about physically what they would do to your brain, although probably there will be some consequences, but mostly it's like how that affects the way that you perceive things, the way that you behave, etc. So I kind of started always with what I believe to be a point that I think will tie everything up with what I'm about to say, right? So I always like to start, sometimes, as I always say, from an anthropological point of view. Sometimes I like to introduce a psychology or psychological theory. But today I actually would like to start with language. And I'm going to title this A Little History About Language because I wanted language to be my starting point. Now, if we inquire about the first written language in history, we have the cuneiform language used by the Sumerians and the Akkadians that appear around 3200 BCE. That is roughly more than $5,000, excuse me, 5,000 years ago. But the oldest recorded language is actually not that one, it's the one found in China. And a piece of pottery found in particular in the Shaanxi, and excuse me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, province, contain proto characters for the number 5, 7, and 8. That is proof that some form of written language was developed to that point. It means that, again, there is people or there's a group of people who had the intention of communicating something, and to make it easier, they would actually use, again, this is called proto characters, which is sometimes not even it refers to the what will become a character in the future, meaning something that is a piece of information that is recognizable. This is more, for example, lines that can be interpreted in one way or the other one, depending on the orientation, etc. So that is what a proto character is. So what is the use of a language in general? Like, what? Why do we even have a language? Well, there are many theories behind the use of language. I'm obviously not qualified to talk about that in particular, about the history of language or why we use that. But I wanted to just kind of give you a rough idea on why language, at least from a neuroscience point of view, came about. And again, it is good also to reflect on the meaning of the language and more specifically about the meaning of written language. So probably our ancestors again experienced firsthand the flaws of oral history. They were trying to communicate with other people, trying to convey important messages, and they realized that there are difficulties behind trying to remember specific important details, but there are definitely some more benefits to oral history too. I'm not going to deny that our history was useful for a very long, it keeps being useful. And among, for example, all the positive things that I can think of is the ability to communicate the tone and put an extra emphasis or emotional component. So when I'm telling you something, I'm not just reading about it. I can actually emphasize the emotions that I perceive if I saw an event, and I can transmit and I can convey that to you. And hopefully you can then convey that message to other people by using a similar tone. Now, when we communicate again with people, especially when we talk about others, it happens a lot, we tend to add tones to the conversations, emphasizing certain words to better convey the message that we try to convey. Again, if I'm talking about someone that I don't like very much, or think about the last time that someone told you a story about someone else that he or she, that person who was telling you the story, did not like that much. So probably you observed that the tone changed. There's some mimicking, the tone changes, there's some emphasis in certain words. In a way, what we're trying to do is we want the listeners, again, to side with us. So we might incorporate, again, things that we know that the others are going to react to. So that is done on purpose. It's not like I'm just making that up. I'm just trying to make you understand from my point of view what I'm trying to say to you. As you can see, language is more than just words. That's clear. Our brain is designed to look for signs, for clues to fully understand what is happening around us. So if you think about it, language is not only designed for me to say, I want this or I want that. It's obviously to communicate dangers, for example, or things that other people need to avoid. So, in accordance to that idea of being safe or looking for safety, our brain was obviously designed to look for clues that can detect when something is more worrisome, something is actually dangerous for us, right? So, as you can see, we're always looking for clues that help us understand our environment to protect our own selves and protect our the people that we love, etc. So, an effective communication has the capacity to not only convey message but also convey more than just the words. Now, let's stop for a second and think about that difference between oral language and written language. So, as I mentioned before, there's some benefits on the oral language and the oral communication in general versus, especially when we compare with the written communication. However, our oral communication failed terribly at one thing in particular, and you guess probably at this point what that might be, and that is, and this was introduced already in the Mandela Effect video, in which I was kind of like talking about how difficult it is for our memory to really remember every single detail when that happened, and that sometimes lead to not only a misunderstanding, but like to even bring the opposite of what happened or try to convey an opposite message to what it was said to us, right? So again, our memory has a limited capacity. What we understand as memory is actually composed by three different and distinct processes. I think I also introduced that idea on the Mandela effect, but just in case, I'm going to review that. So basically, the first one is recording. So imagine that someone tells you something. So the first thing that you do is you pay attention, and then you try to record that information or the information that you're exposed to. So it's not necessarily that a person is telling you a message. It could be like you're actually looking at something and then you're recording that information. The second one, the second process is the encoding process. And in this case, is the process for which the information is classified first and then stored in our brain. And the third one, meaning the third process, is the one with where we look for the recalling, or we talk about the recalling process. And that is a process in which we try to bring the information back to our conscious. So if I tell you to record an information and then I tell you to read something that I later on I'm going to test you, you probably are going to pay attention. You might even try to make an effort, use mnemonics, but you probably have experienced this, that even despite doing all that effort, then someone asks you about a question about that thing particular that you were reading, and you cannot remember. You don't have access to that memory. So that is a recalling process, right? Now, the problem with oral language and memorization is that it can fail at any of these steps. It's not a failure only on recording. Also, again, a person can fail at recording, of course. Therefore, if a person tries to communicate with another person or other people, the message will not be precise because, again, I didn't record it properly. A person can also fail at classifying that information. So let's say that you record that information properly, quote unquote, properly, but you didn't classify it correctly. It was kind of like recording a different process. So now if someone is trying to ask you a question about that process in particular, or if you're trying to bring that information again, it's going to be difficult because it's as if you're trying to look for a piece not a piece, but an object that you have put at some place that you cannot remember. It was actually misplaced. And then you're looking for all the places that you would normally put that object, like a box in particular that you put all the similar objects to that. And then you're looking for that and you cannot find that object. And it turns out that at that moment you decided to misplace that, or you were not even conscious of that. You misplaced it. And despite dedicating a lot of time and trying to look for that object, you realize that that object was placed in a different location. So again, we might actually fail in oral history by classifying the information improperly, meaning put it in a place that it doesn't belong to or it shouldn't be. And obviously, a person can fail at recalling the information, meaning even if you have placed everything correctly, even if you have recorded that properly, there's still chances that you might not have the ability to bring that information from where it is at to your conscious mind. So again, that happens a lot, especially with people who have memory problems, right? Now, to make matters worse, failure on any of these steps are accumulative. That means that if you fail at any process and then you, for example, you fail at recording and then you try to tell that message to someone else, probably the next time that you tell that information is not going to be the same. You're kind of like filling the gap between the message that was given to you and what you remember. And we kind of saw that already in the Mandela effect, in which I was explaining how memory works, and I was explaining that every time you try to bring back to your conscious mind that memory, what you're doing is half remembering what you would like have remembering the picture, the sounds, and everything that you remember, and half creating or compensating for the lack of information, the information that you cannot easily remember. And that happens a lot all the time, right? So again, the next time that we tell the information to someone else, you will pass an already faulty message, and then obviously that person will then pass the faulty information to someone else. Now, so you can see there are many reasons why a written language could be potentially more beneficial. But now that we kind of understand the meaning behind this, the meaning behind the reason why we have a language, I wanted to stop for a second and think about how communication used to be like. And I don't want to be very I don't want to romantic. I don't want to be very romantic about that concept of how it was versus how it is nowadays. But we kind of have to establish a difference between the language and the process in which we have been embarking in the last decades with the new medias and how it used to be for a very long time. Now, throughout all history, since the invention of written languages, communication was very similar. There was the oral language. Again, that was the most direct way of communication. Someone else will tell you an information. So that required you to be in front of the person who is telling you that information, and intended for a person to communicate with another person or a small group of people. Big gatherings were not a thing until recently because obviously your voice can only travel so far. And yes, their inventions to our history, they were trying to compensate for that. Like, for example, if you look at the way that that podiums were designed in ancient Rome and even theaters to amplify the sound, it was wonderful just by using just the ways of using the waves, the location, even water sometimes to transmit the in this case, it sounds much better. That is incredible, but it's only until fairly recently that we could communicate with a large audience because, again, that wouldn't be literally possible just by the way that we communicate by using our words. We would need technology for that. Now, the most widely available form of communication, however, was the written language. Obviously, because that allowed now people who are not physically there in front of you to have access to that information, and even people in the future. So when people started to write, it was not necessarily only because they were interested in sending that message to other people who live far away, but to preserve certain information for what they consider would be useful for the future. Now, these type of communication, again, the oral language and written language in that manner, used to be untouched for millennials. Our brains were used to communicating in this manner, and obviously our brain was evolved to actually pay attention to those things. Now think about all the times you might have experienced having a conversation with someone and having a gut feeling, not understanding exactly why, but not trusting what the other person said. Although, yeah, that is a very faulty also mechanism, like that idea of, yeah, I trust my gut. By now, you should know that there are biases and that can actually make you misinterpret what another person says. That idea of the gut feeling comes from an understanding that language is more than just the words that you use, but also the body language, the tone, etc. So think about also the ways in which you might have changed your voice when talking about someone else. The same thing that I was telling you about before. Imagine that you're talking about someone that you don't like, or someone that you like, someone that you do respect. You probably are going to use the language, the tone, excuse me, in a different way to emphasize and make look better when you like the person that you're talking about than when you are talking about someone that you despise. In this case, you might change your voice. You might even make faces that, again, the other person now can interpret not only that you don't like that person, that probably that person, the person who is listening to you right now, is recording that information in a manner that probably, without even knowing that third person that you're talking about, this person might interpret as, oh, that person is not a good person, just because of the way that you talk. Now, that is a crucial part of how we communicate with others, and that is one of the main problems that we encounter with social media. And with Twitter in particular, it's not only social media, obviously, it's not only about Twitter. I said that social media is guilty sometimes of that, but Twitter in particular is more guilty of that. And I'm going to say why in a second. We are missing all the other components we normally find in oral communication, which is again this lack of direct communication conditions, the understanding of the message, and it also that idea of missing the communication, like the things that are happening at the same time that someone is communicating, the tones, the body language. We are all missing about that, right? But it also conditions the way we pass information to others, right? So again, if we are hearing someone talking about someone else that that person despises, um, then maybe I'm going to pass it that message. I'm going to record those messages and the tone, and I might pass that information to someone else. Now, I'm going to leave you now with a question. How long does it take to digest information? And I know that that is kind of like a random question, and you probably think, well, it really depends. And you are right. As I talked about before, the memorization process can be divided into three distinctive parts: recording, encoding, and recalling. And recording is the first process for which you are recording the information that is being given to you, or the information that you're just taking from the environment. Encoding is that idea of organizing that information and putting it in the place that we needed to put. And recalling is the process for which we're bringing back to our conscious mind that information, or at least as many details as possible from that information. Now, during the encoding process is where we classify and organize the information. That process takes a lot of time. These would vary depending on the conditions, and that's why the question was tricky, right? For example, how much information is given at once? That's one of the main keys. If I give you, let's say that I give you like two different messages that are very complicated, and they are all based on information that you have never heard before. That is different than if I tell you just a gossip about someone that you already do know. Like the mental effort is different. But it's not the only thing. Also, like the number of people giving the information at the same time. Like sometimes you might encounter that two people or three people are talking about the same person, and they're trying to communicate with you. They're trying to tell you certain information and giving you that information at the same time. And they turns out that they have different ways of telling you that information. As you can see, you're going to record that information very differently than those people in isolation. Now, how much of that information, again, is based on new concepts or concepts that we already understand? Our energy levels also take, it's also important to take into account our energy levels. If we are low energy, if we are not paying attention, if we are not focused, our capacity, again, to focus, or even our age, that those all are things that can actually have an effect in the way that we not only record, but also encode the information. Now, all of these elements and others, not only those, again, those are just a few examples, will affect the way that we digest information and the time will take us to fully understand the concepts we're trying to understand. There's one aspect that can affect the way we perceive things, and therefore it will also have an effect over the way we process information and the way that we digest that information. And I wanted to emphasize that because we're talking about like all these elements in isolation that can affect the way that you perceive things. Like, for example, people talking at the same time, giving you different type of messages, different tones, your capacity to focus. All of that can actually be affected by one thing, and that is stress, particular extrinsic stress. And I want to emphasize that. And I know that By now, probably you're thinking, well, you lost me there. I don't know how that is related to Twitter. As usual, I will ask you, please bear with me because I guarantee this will all make sense. But for that, I actually need to make that distinction. I introduced that idea of extrinsic stress. So what is extrinsic, stress? That is the type of stress that is not related to the task at hand, while intrinsic stress is actually the type of stress that is related to the task. For example, a complicated math problem can be a form of intrinsic stress. You're trying to think about how to solve the problem, but the stress that you're feeling of not being able to figure out is part of the process of you trying to figure out that problem. So again, this is an example of intrinsic stress. And by the way, this is actually a good type of stress because that is actually being shown to help people understand and the process, and also how to help them on learning the process and facilitating not only the processing of the information, but also the future recalling and memorization of the same process. So again, that is intrinsic stress. But what happened with the extrinsic stress? Well, that is actually the opposite effect. It has this is again the type of stress that is not related or intrinsically related to the task at hand, and that it has the opposite effect. So if someone is making you nervous, saying, "Hey, come on, hurry up," stuff like that, that is the type of stress that is not helpful for learning. Now, I'm going to stop right here because I know that a lot of people insist on, well, some form of stress is good. Just keep in mind that from a neuroscience point of view, when people say stress has a benefit, that's what it means. Someone shouting in your ear, that is not going to contribute. If anything, is actually making you worse. The only thing that you might sometimes experience is that because you're solving a problem, meaning kicking the intrinsic stress, you might actually overcome a problem and think that you're doing great. And that is kind of like compensating for the extrinsic stress. But if you're feeling that intrinsic stress, the extrinsic stress is not going to do anything. Again, it's only going to make things worse. Now, it has a negative effect on how we record the information. Of course, I'm talking about the extrinsic stress, how we organize, and even how, in this case, our capacity to recall that information. So again, as you can see, the extrinsic effect stress has an effect on all of the three processes that we discussed on memorization. So this can be manifested when we are pressed in time. That is again one of the main dilemmas, right? Sometimes people romanticize that idea of, well, sometimes when you have very few times, your creativity kicks in. It's like, well, there's some truth behind that. But again, if you exacerbate that and then now you're kicking with the extrinsic stress, now what you're doing is actually the opposite. You're actually becoming not only slower in the processing, it's just that you might have more ideas, but those ideas are going to be worse ideas. So again, this can be manifested when we're pressing time. Our capacity to focus, record information, and even recall information diminishes when we have the feeling of limited time. Now, hopefully by now, by introducing that idea of feeling of having limited time and how that affects, you can kind of draw a parallelism with what we were discussing and how Twitter is kicking that in you when you have the feeling that I only have 144 characters, I have to hurry up. And it also manifests when we feel angry or feel threatened. So that stress that I was discussing about is not only about feeling that you don't have any time, that you have to hurry up. It also manifests when we feel angry, when someone is making us feel angry, or when we feel threatened, or when we feel frustrated. Now, the next slide is going to be titled Phone, the Beginning of Miscommunication, because I wanted to kind of like be meet in between, meet in the middle. As I said, I don't want to romanticize too much the way that we were dealing with language, or the way that we developed language in the past versus now. And I wanted to kind of tell you that, yes, there has been an evolution and things have been changing. And in fact, the change didn't exactly happen 20 years ago or 30 years ago, depending on how people discover the internet. It, in fact, started to happen once we created progressive technology. In this case, I wanted to focus on phone and how that has an effect on the way that we communicate with others. So I discussed how direct communication offered a richer form of communication. Again, you talking directly to someone or someone talking directly to you, and how we creation of the or how the creation of the written language, although more precise, reduces the component of a communication. But the written language is not the only form of communication where those components were lost. When the phone was invented, there was a loss of body language. Again, imagine this throughout all history, and since you were little, the only thing that you have encountered are people talking to you or things that you have read, meaning the written word, and all of a sudden there's an invention that you discover where people can actually use an object to talk to other people that are far. So obviously, at that moment, and you can imagine the first people who experience having phone calls, how that changes the way that you perceive communication, the way that you not only perceive, but the way that you take that message. Now, when the phone was invented, there was a loss of body language, as I was saying. Also, there are other components that are not necessarily for a conversation that could affect the way that we behave around other people. For example, having to face a person that was also lost. What do I mean by that? Like, not only forget about the body language, but the psychological effect of having a person in front of you that having to measure your words. Imagine the freedom that now you uh, can exercise if you can just talk to someone on the phone and then just disappear. Whenever you don't want, just hang up the phone and just leave. That is something that probably in the past, before the invention of the phone, people really have to think about. Like, do I have to be careful with the things that I'm going to say because I don't want to anger that person because that person is in front of me and that person can hit me, can shame me. All of those things all of a sudden disappear with the phone. Now, at this point, you might ask yourself again, how is any of this related to Twitter, or how is that even related to the written communication? Well, if we follow along with all the things that I have mentioned so far, our brain is accustomed to getting information from different sources, not only from, again, the words that we hear and the way that we already put the meaning that we put to those words, but also the tone. How do we interpret those tones, especially if you're a person within the same culture? Those things have meaning. But again, it's not the only thing. It's not only about the tone, body language. What if the person makes faces? All of that is lost just with the invention of the phone. Again, so the phone was created and we lost the body language, making it more difficult for a person to interpret what the other person wanted to say precisely. So again, I get it. I can clarify that information. I get what the other person is saying or trying to say to me, but that requires me to actually really double check just in case. Otherwise, I would just leave a conversation thinking that what I believe that person was trying to tell me is the same thing that I'm now recalling, the same thing that I'm remembering. And again, that requires some communication and maybe sometimes a feedback. Hey, what do you mean by that? Because I cannot see you, right? Now, how many characters are needed in a conversation? When we think about having a conversation, especially we think about the way people used to have conversations, we have to think about the meaning of conversations were different. Before was just for the sake of communicating something, right? You wanted to say something to someone else and that's it. Today is not necessarily true. It's not the only way in which you can communicate with someone. You can communicate with someone just to appeal to someone else. You can say something just for the sake of saying it because you want to hear it out loud, not necessarily because you have the intention of communicating with someone else. Now, if that is the case, we also have to think about what is needed for us to communicate. Is there a set of words that are considered like the minimum of a conversation? So I believe that that is actually the wrong question to ask. I remember seeing a an interview of the CEO, well, now ex CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, where he was saying that he liked that minimal form of communication he found it useful, that he found that being more precise, that it doesn't waste time. But if we're trying to communicate with other people, we cannot force that form of communication to every single thing that we're trying to say. There are certain instances in which we need more words, certain instances in which we cannot even express that with words. You actually have to be in front of the person. So all of that is actually part of the conversation around how many characters or words are needed in a conversation. The problem with a fixed number of characters, especially with a small number of characters, is that not only do we lose the majority of important parts of the conversation, which is what we were discussing before, the body language, the tone, situation, and context, but now we have to even think about, you have to think too much about what we want to say and convey with a small number of characters. We have to not only be worried about how the other person is going to perceive my message, which is how we normally would handle a conversation. I'm just saying things and hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say. But now I have to focus on how to say that with this number of characters and how can that be interpreted. So that factor alone, having to think too much about how to convey the proper message with a small number of characters, might put us already in an anxious state to start a conversation. And as I stated before, starting a conversation at an anxious state is never a good idea. Being misunderstood, or should I say, being perceived or perceiving yourself as being misunderstood, there's that distinction between, again, being misunderstood or you perceiving that other people are misunderstanding you, and having to explain yourself with the fear of being misunderstood again increases again our level of stress and anxiety. So again, it's not only a matter of I'm already nervous because I don't know how this message is going to be taken by other people. I don't know how other people are going to react to what I'm about to say. If you put an extra layer of complications, which is now you have to say it in these 144 characters. Oh, and by the way, if you make a mistake, people might misunderstood you. And then when you try to explain it again, you might be misunderstood again. So all of that is adding a lot of stress and anxiety. And in this case, it's not the good type. It's not the intrinsic stress. It's the bad extrinsic stress that can actually not make things better. Remember what happens with extrinsic stress again? It has an influence not only in the way that we learn, but in the way our memory works. Why is that important? Why is it important for us to understand our memory and talk about the intrinsic stress and extrinsic stress? Because when we try to form arguments, we tend to pull from all the information that we have gathered, all the information that we have archived in our memories. And we try to find the proper information. So when we are under stress, when we are pressed in time, when we feel that we don't have enough time, the access to that information can be compromised. Having access to certain information that might not be that useful for us right now, but not to other information that actually might be the one type of information that we need. Now, guess what information is easily available to all of us all the time? So probably you guessed it, the information that doesn't need much thinking. And we have discussed that, the system one, your system one. The downside of this particular, of having access to that type of information, again, the information that does not require us to think about too much, is that we have access, our instinct is to answer and to answer fast to get out of a situation, right? So it's an instinct for us to, when we are in present time, it's like, okay, I need easy information. This is the information that comes to my mind. I'm going to tell that information right away. Primarily because we might perceive ourselves as being threatened. So again, one of the reasons why the system one was created, again, is because we couldn't learn everything all the time from zero. Like we needed to have certain answers that are easily accessible to us. And as I always say, that is also a beneficial mechanism. It saved us a lot of times. The problem is that it's not a solution for everything. And we try to use it all the time. Well, we unfortunately use it all the time without even our conscience, especially when we're pressing time, where we feel a lot of stress. Our tendency is to focus on the system one, on to have access to certain information and regurgitate that information as fast as possible, because you really want to get out of that situation. Now, if you remember by the video I made on the confirmation bias, I think I remember specifically saying that, but if anything, I'm going to clarify some concept. And as I think I have repeated this over and over again. When we feel threatened, we tend to look for safety. And that safety can be manifested in many ways, like getting information that confirms our preconceived ideas is one is actually one of the main ways in which we feel better about ourselves, because all of a sudden it gives us the comfort of knowing at least that we are quote unquote right. Now, it's not the only way that we have to compensate for that. Obviously, it's not the only way, like confirmation bias is not the only way in which makes us, or we're looking for ways to feel well. So you can see, sometimes, again, getting the information that confirms our point of view is one, but sometimes we have other ways, like trying to say the first thing that comes to our mind just to escape the situation. And that is also another common way of doing it. Again, it's not necessarily I'm looking for a particular person who agrees with me, and if not, I'm just going to continue. Sometimes we're so pressed in time that when we don't find people who side with us, we just immediately have access to certain information, and then we say that information just to get out of that situation, a situation that feels us makes us feel threatened or makes us feel uncomfortable. So as you can see, that is an example of avoidance. Again, I'm not trying to look for the group, in this case, to the confirmation bias through other people who confirm my preconceived ideas to feel safer. But in this case, we're trying to avoid that. We're trying to avoid by saying whatever first comes to our heads. Now, starting a conversation with fear and stress. I already introduced that idea when I first talked about Facebook, and I think this is common not only for Twitter and Facebook, but with all social medias. As I discussed before, when we feel stressed or afraid, we tend to use, again, the system one. The problem with this system one is that it brings the information that is already easily available to us. Strong emotions like fear, anger, etc., will be easily accessible to us. Once we are in that state, again, stress, afraid, the language that comes to our minds are trying to match those feelings, those emotions, and obviously the words that we're going to have access to and the information that we're going to be having access to is conditioned by those emotions as well. The problem with the emotions, in particular with strong emotions, is that they might be contagious. So it's not only about me being in an anger state and then convey a message in an angry manner. It's that probably I will trigger the other person to either be angry or sometimes even bother or frustrated with my way of communicating that. Think about this. When was the last time that you read a post, watch a video on social media, and get angry? Like you were reading something, you were watching a video, and you get upset. What is exactly what would trigger you? What is exactly that you hear that made you feel uncomfortable? And forgive us for a second the reasons behind that, because probably you might justify this by saying, well, it clearly made me feel uncomfortable because I heard these words and this is unacceptable, or this is horrible, or this person is inhumane. Forget about those reasons for a second. Even the statements of the things that were being said or the things that you were reading. The most important thing to consider is how you felt before you read that. Because in that case, and that is something that you need to consider, something you read or watched made you feel that way. So you were not responsible for those feelings. Well, you were responsible, meaning you are responsible, you're an adult, probably. So you have the capacity to certain control, to certain degree, or control to certain degree those emotions. But you were kind of led by these words. You were kind of led by these emotions. So that is part of the virality of emotions that we have discussed in the past. And it works in both the positive and the negative. But unfortunately, and as I was explaining before, and I think that this has been a constant throughout all this series, negative emotions tend to spread faster and wider than positive ones. I've given you plenty of reasons, but you just have to remember one, and that is because obviously negative emotions reflect something that you have to be careful. Like if you're angry, excuse me, if you have fear, especially fear, there's something that that fear is telling you. It's like, hey, watch out for this because you might get killed. So obviously, our brain is designed to look for those and to pay more attention to those because it literally can save your life. So with all of these that I have discussed so far, I wanted to kind of wrap up that idea with how the in-group bias and confirmation bias tend to interact. So as I have discussed in the in-group bias and the confirmation bias videos, when we feel threatened and we tend to look for safety, and that is a common way again, we feel threatened, we don't understand our surroundings, what is the first thing that you're trying to do? Obviously, you're trying to look back for some safety because you don't want to continue feeling that way. By the way, again, your brain is designed to look for safety because that, again, if you the lack of safety used to mean a detrimental loss of quality of life or literally a matter of life and death in some situations. So um, again, when we encounter those situations, our first response is always trying to look for safety. When we feel threatened, we tend to look for safety. We look for ways to make us feel, and that is the key that I wanted um, to emphasize, make us feel that we understand our surroundings. It doesn't have to do with real safety, like from an objective point of view. It's just our brain interacting for us and making us feel safe because again our brain doesn't make that distinction between real or not real. The way that the brain interprets real is how you feel safer because now you're looking at things and you're gathering information and you're feeling safe, but maybe there's some things that you were not paying attention and then you are actually not that safe or not as safe as you thought. In this case, our brain doesn't make that distinction because, again, our brain is looking for particular cues. Now, that is why hearing things that confirm our perception of reality or meeting with people who side with us makes us feel good and reassures our sense of safety. And again, sometimes it doesn't even have to go to that extreme. It can just be because you feel better, because it reassures you in a way that makes you feel better. And that is especially important, especially when you're confronted with the opposite. When you're in a very stressful situation, being reassured actually has a beneficial a benefit, and obviously you're going to be looking for that just for the sake of feeling better, not necessarily for the sake of feeling safe. Also, when we encounter people who makes us feel insecure or contradict our perception of reality, we tend to react by protecting ourselves first. That's the first thing that we do. We tend to protect ourselves first and others like us because, again, we tend to protect the group. And later, we tend to attack the people we perceive as the others. Sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish because the protection and the attack comes at the same time because the attack is the way that you're going to protect yourself. But yes, just so you have an understanding, there are three-part process. First is going to be feeling unsafe, and then you tend to protect yourself. Second, you are trying to look for people who make you feel safe, and then third, you tend to attack the people that you perceive as others. Now, finding that comfort in others is a natural way of dealing with our problems. It increases our chances of survival. We have discussed at length, I think, at this series. The same way our ancestors look for other people, kind of like to divide all the tasks that people need to do in order for them to survive. So obviously, you look for people who can actually make you feel better because you're looking for a way to compensate for, you know, the lack of food, for example. Well, someone can be in charge of finding food, while I can be in charge of finding shelter. Another person can be in charge of looking for potential danger, etc. So all of that is something that obviously it comes from our ancestors' brain, and again, it's part of our evolution. And as you can see, again, it could be beneficial. The problem comes when we're constantly looking for validation from others, and worse, when we adopt the beliefs and behaviors of that group. I think that that was probably more clear when I was discussing the in-group bias. Because when we do, we might lose the way that we truly feel and think, and substitute those ideas or those beliefs that we have for the ones that the group dictates. And yes, the video that I recorded on that explains a little bit different, but pretty much the emphasis is that it's like we're trying to look for a way for us to feel safe, but at the same time, the other side, the downside of that is that we might lose ourselves into the group because it's so beneficial for us to be part of a group that we might end up just giving up certain things just as an exchange for us to be as part of the group. That's kind of like the cost of belonging to that group. Now, the next scene, I decided to title this The Powerful People, Media, and Twitter, because kind of introduce that idea of in-group bias and groupthink, but I wanted to, confirmation bias, excuse me, but now I wanted to introduce that idea on how groups are created and how certain people, leaders, powerful people can actually take advantage of that and move people in one direction or the other one. As we have discussed ad nauseum at this point, being part of a group is extremely beneficial, and not being part of one, meaning not being part of a group, is clearly one thing that you would fear the most because it's extremely dangerous to live just by yourself. There are two extreme conditions. There's two extremes. These two, meaning the extreme of having the benefits of being part of a group and pushing you towards the side, and the extreme negatives of not being part of a group. They both push you in the same direction. They push you and they condition our need to belong into a group. That is clear. That is, you know, fairly clear because again, there's no even compensation for the system. The system in both extremes is pushing you to do the exact same thing. The quality of the group is also important. And I know that it's very difficult for us to kind of like measure the quality. When we talk about quality of the group, what is the quality? Well, we can measure the quality of a group in many ways. Like, for example, the amount of support from the group, like how much support the group is giving you, the strength of the bonding within the members of the group. Are you feeling connected with this group, or you're just like, all right, so these are people that I just hang out with, but I don't necessarily feel supported. Now, as we have stated in other videos, rich and famous people are attractive for many reasons. It represents the way a lot of people want to feel and live. Like when you think about a famous person, a celebrity, and the envy that sometimes they seem to evoke, all of that envy comes from that idea of wanting to feel like them, like wanting to experience those things, or at least the things that we perceive them as feeling and experiencing them. But in this case, it's not necessarily true. As I said before, all of that is just the way that we perceive, not reality. There's no doubt that our perception about the rich and famous has changed in many ways. For example, it is not an exclusive domain of movie stars and singers or radio personalities before. In today's world, we admire people from different walks of life, and now we have the YouTubers, the TikTokers, the Instagrammers. There's also a strong sense of morality that comes with that idea of what is right and wrong, and the audience is willing to fight for those values. What I mean by that is, it's not only a matter of being famous anymore. It's not a matter of, I have this large following. It is also important that there's certain values that people feel represented by and values that people can share, because that can literally change and switch people from liking you to hating you immediately. When these famous people are aligned with those values, meaning the values of fairness, positivity, or goodness, the bonding with these people are very strong. Obviously, the people who are liking these famous people, the people who form this group that are fans of these famous people, if again there's an alignment, excuse me, between the people in the group and the famous person, the personality, definitely the bonding is going to be way stronger than if they're just people that there's a disconnection. Now, when these famous people again are aligned with those values, then the bonding with these people tend to be very strong. This creates what we have discussed in the past as the in-group bias or preference for the members of what we perceive, or at least we perceive as members of the same group. So when somebody attacks a person of this group, the people who are part of this group feel the attack and react accordingly. Now, during the 20th century, the media depended on created that sense of trust with the audience. There's obviously an enormous pressure on created that sense of fairness, on the person is telling me the truth. And the relationship between the media and the audience was almost unaltered until fairly recently. Meaning, there was always that bonding between the personalities of the media and then the people who follow them. I'm not saying necessarily that that doesn't exist anymore. I'm just saying that obviously now there are more sites and it's more difficult to really follow or to continue with the same bonding. Now, what happens is that with the creation of the internet in general and the social media in particular, for the first time, the communication was not exclusively at the hands of very few people from these media or the what you might call it mainstream media or just traditional media. But thanks to the anonymity and the internet, not only allow other people to now communicate the way that they wanted to communicate, but also it's particular about the thanks to the anonymity, the internet allowed people to communicate freely since there was again no necessarily fear of punishment and to see what others had to say. So again, imagine that thing alone, that freedom that only exists now, meaning now comparison with the rest of history, pretty much. The freedom of being able to say whatever you want without the fear of being punished is so freeing that now people just say whatever they want, even when they don't think about it. And now I wanted to stop there because by the way that I was saying it,